for the masses.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army.
If the game is rigged, change the game. Game changer.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
This is Fade to Black with your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Radio Network and KGRA, the Global Radio Alliance.
I need your help to get to the year 1985.
You're listening to Fade to Black with Jimmy Church on the Game Changer Network.
Good evening. Fade to Black. Bespoke Radio. For the masses. Yeah, today's Monday, November 11th, 2019. $315 days into the new year, just 51 days left. We're live from a bunker somewhere in the middle of beautiful downtown Burbank, California. And I would like to welcome everybody listening all around the world, all across the United States. Hither and thither, to and fro, back and forth, up and down, east and west, north and south, far and near. This is Fade to Black for KJCR, the Game Changer Network, and KGRA, the planet. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. What is cracking, everybody? How you doing? Today's Monday. Yes, it is Monday, 11/11/19. Very special day for some of you. More on that in just a minute. Kicking off this week tonight, Andrew Collins is here live from the United Kingdom to discuss his new book. Here it is. Right there. Right there. Now, some say incorrectly Denisovan. 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 We're going to find out how to say it tonight. And do you know, Andrew, hybrid humans, Gobekli Tepe, and the genesis of giants of ancient America. You know, Andrew, nobody says Gobekli Tepe finer. And speaking with him about this book, I had to stop. I said, wait a minute. Let's stop right there. We'll talk about all of that tonight on the show. The book is an amazing read. And especially, it's done in two parts. He wrote the first half of the book, and then Gregory L. Little did the second half. And it's an incredible read. It's a real eye-opener. And so that's tonight. Gobekli Tepe, hybrid humans, not hybrid as you may think, but maybe, right? Welcome back, Fade to Black. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, Andrew Collins is here. Tomorrow night, Jeffrey Mishlove. Get ready for that. Wednesday night, Ed Nightingale is back to talk about Leonardo da Vinci and the Giza template. Thursday night is another Fader night with open lines all night long. Tonight, it's Andrew Collins. Yes, he's an author. He's a researcher. And he's here to discuss his new book. He wrote the first half. Second half is written by Gregory Little. Denisovan Origins, Hybrid Humans, Gobekli Tepe, and the Genesis of the Giants of Ancient America. He is a writer, he's a historian, and he is the author of more than a dozen books that challenge the way we perceive the past, They include From the Ashes of Angels, Tutankhamen, The Exodus Conspiracy, co-authored with Chris Ogilvie Herald, and The Cygnus Mystery and LightQuest, Gobekli Tepe, The Genesis of the Gods, and Atlantis in the Caribbean. In 2008, Andrew and his colleague Nigel Skinner Simpson discovered a previously unrecorded cave complex beneath the pyramids of Giza. Still one of the more harrowing videos I have ever watched in my life. His website is, of course, andrewcollins.com. I would like to welcome back to Faded Black, Andrew Collins. Andrew, good morning.
Good morning to you, Jimmy.
Do you ever do you ever feel claustrophobic and go back and watch that video? I mean,
yes, I do watch it. I mean, in some ways, I can't believe A, that we were doing it, and B, that we weren't wearing protective clothing for most of it. It looks like we just wandered in there, but it actually took a lot of planning, and we would like to have continued the work. But I mean, we got in 4 times and explored as far as we possibly could safely, without carbon dioxide poisoning or whatever. And just had to leave it there. And of course, it was rediscovered the following year by Zahi Hawass himself, of course. The whole thing was on television on a reality show called Chasing Mummies that followed around Zahi Hawass. And there's a whole episode where he goes inside the caves and says this is the greatest adventure he's had at Giza ever, basically. And this is after he denied that the caves actually existed when we'd found them. He actually put this online that all we discovered is a tomb that everybody knew about, but that proved that he had no knowledge whatsoever of these caves, and even after we'd found them, refused to believe that they actually existed.
The video, I remember the first time, I've watched it so many times. It's a tremendous achievement that you guys did, but I had to watch it in spurts. I couldn't watch it straight through. The claustrophobic atmosphere of what you guys were doing, and you don't know what lies in front of you, which is crazy to me. And it's just an incredible video and an incredible discovery. When you guys first, we'll move on quickly, but you and I have talked about this so many times, but I remember when you guys were first in the Tomb of the Birds or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
And you flash your flash and you see that little opening in the back.
Yeah.
And the last thing that would be on my mind is crawling through that. That would be the last thing, man. And you guys actually did not knowing what was on the other side. And it was just an incredible achievement, seriously.
I mean, in some ways, I looked through that hole and thought, oh, my God, that looks incredibly dangerous. And, of course, it was. But, I mean, that's what I'm in it for. I mean, I suppose we've all seen Indiana Jones films in our lives and know what people like that, as fictitious as he is, what they have to do, and you have to do it. You are now in that position, and I also remember thinking that of the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb by Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon, and then piercing that little hole, through the door and Carnarvon to say, what is it? What have you found? And he turns around and says wonderful things, and I deliberately put words to that effect to the Edgar Cayce Foundation, who were partly responsible for funding the investigation of the caves, and I deliberately worded the whole thing, wonderful things type thing, because it was a wonderful things moment for me. And I don't think there'll be anything as equal to that. I mean, obviously different things. I mean, I'm on new research, of course, all the time, but I'm unlikely to get something like that happening again, I would say.
Yeah, that's a singular achievement. No, there's no question about it. And if anybody is wondering what Andrew and I are talking about, you can Google it and head over to YouTube and check out the series of videos of Andrew and his team crawling through that hole and what they found. And that was actually over. That was a year, right? You started one year and finished the second.
Yeah. I mean, we first went in the Tomb of Birds in 2007 because by the way, we didn't just fall into this. I mean, this was the end of about a 5-year research project.
Right.
I mean, myself and Nigel Skinner Simpson had worked out that somewhere in that vicinity was the entrance to a cave complex that everybody had overlooked and was not mentioned in any orthodox book on the Giza Plateau, and certainly was not included in any academic paper or anything. So we knew that when we uncovered a diary account from a British consul guy for Egypt from 1819 that had talked about going in these caves with an Italian explorer, that whatever it was that they were in certainly wasn't recorded, and we had to try and track down where that was, because clearly it once existed, and the chances are the entrance was still there somewhere, but had just been lost. That's why I always say we rediscovered, because quite clearly it had been found at the beginning of the 19th century. Plus the chances are, others had discovered it at a much earlier time, probably even as early as Roman times, and had got in there and done whatever they'd done in there. But it had been completely overlooked. It's almost like it was like a blind spot. It was in the northwest corner of the Giza Plateau, which obviously by its sheer nature means that it's raised up, and like a platform. And one of the reasons why nobody had discovered it in the past is because it was directly below a presidential building. The old Egyptian president, Mubarak, would actually helicopter into a building in that locality, which was very clearly very heavily guarded and had been until about 4 or 5 years before we discovered it. And he'd stopped going there, and of course, obviously, eventually stopped being president. But it then became a house for engineers working locally in the area of the Giza Plateau when we actually discovered it. But it was one of these things. People say, "Well, how did you get over there?" We said, "Well, all we did was just get a tourist pass. That's all." But we were very clever, because usually anyone getting anywhere near that part of the plateau would be turned away by guards, by security police, whatever. But what I knew is that if we came onto the plateau from the back, and there was a back door into the plateau on camels, and just went straight over there, having already got our pass as part of a camel ride, we could get there. And we wouldn't be stopped, or it'd be very unlikely that we'd be stopped with all our equipment. So that's what we did. We went over there. We got there. There was a local guardian there. What I mean by that is somebody who lives in the vicinity and looks after any tombs in a particular area. I mean, he was a really old guy. He said he'd never been in these. He knew about the caves, but he'd never been in there. And he said that in the whole of his time, he knew nobody that had actually been in the caves. He said one guy in the 1980s, an Egyptologist, had looked in them, but had decided against exploring them. And that was the one person. Now, this is the guy that would know if anybody had been in there. And as I said, the sheer fact that somebody like Zahi Hawass, who'd been in charge of excavations on the plateau for many years, didn't know about it, tells you that this was something new, something that had truly not been explored before.
Before we move on, how many times, I know this is pretty well documented, but how many times did you walk through the Tomb of the Birds? Because it was the last day. You guys were done when you made the discovery. You guys, it was just
it wasn't a case of being done. I mean, we gave up one year and just said, well, look, we can't find anything. Bearing in mind that these tombs are completely in darkness. I think this should be pointed out. There's no lighting in them. So, there's nothing that shows you everything you need to see, in an easily available, electric light. So we could be excused for missing a very small hole at the back of the tomb in one of the corridors. And we but the information came back that it was somewhere in that area, and we even found a map, and the map had to be interpreted because it was all done through letters A to Z and AA, BB, CC. It was covered, and it talked about. We found another reference to caves being in an area which I can't remember what they were now, HH or something like that, and the way that the whole thing was written, it was done at the beginning of the 19th century, was so poorly represented as far as the way that we would do a map today and
it wasn't an accurate survey. It was just a sketch.
Yes, it was. Yeah. And because of that, it had to be interpreted. So Nigel went through every single site on the whole of the plateau mentioned in the diary accounts, ticking them off against the letters until there was just one site that was missing, and it was these caves, and we had one double set of letters left marked, and it almost was perfectly coinciding with what we'd already started to call the Tomb of the Birds. So we knew that we must be in the right area, and that's why we went back, because we thought, well, it can only be this cave. I mean, there was another tiny couple of tombs nearby, all of which, by the way, were unrecorded. I mean, they were not in any books. The only reference to the Tomb of the Birds was from a guy called Howard Weiss back in about 1839, where it said that he and his British engineer friend John Perring had actually been inside the tomb, not the caves, and had found the bodies, the mummies of birds, of large birds in there, which is obviously the reason why it's called the Tomb of the Birds today. And what this told us is that clearly this tomb was associated with a cult to do with a particular god or goddess, most obviously a god, that was connected with birds, probably the god Thoth or Thoth, who's associated with the ibis as a bird, a totem, but perhaps the god Sokar. Now, he is the very ancient god of the dead who was connected with the Giza necropolis, and his symbol was the hawk or falcon. So it's a possibility this could have been a site of his. Unfortunately, there's no way of knowing because those bird mummies, were not preserved through to modern times, so we can't say. But this again told us something special was going on in that tomb, and that it could well be that the fact that somewhere there is an entrance into a cave system as a symbol of the Egyptian underworld known as the Duat, that it became connected with the cult of the dead, a cult of a particular god or whatever. And I think we would probably obviously prove correct in that case. That's the reason why it was associated with this, this god associated with a bird, because it was the whole caves were a physical representation of the Egyptian underworld known as the Duat. That's what they are.
You know what? It looks Duat-ish for sure.
Yeah.
It is. It's creepy. I mean, it's an incredible video.
Yeah. So just out of interest, tell if the listeners want to go for this, go to YouTube and just put my name, Andrew Collins, or just put the Lost Caves of Giza, and that brings you up the video, which was put together by Greg Little, who is the co-author of my current book, Denisovan Origins, which comfortably brings us on to that book.
And I'm pulling it up now. I will get, here it is right here. I'll get this up during the break, and everybody needs to go and watch this. It's a pretty incredible video. Pretty incredible.
Yeah. It's very well done as well. I mean, he's done an incredible job. He's got recreations, reconstructions, all sorts of stuff in there. It's a brilliantly put together video, and it's free. You can just watch it.
Say the title of your new book.
Denisovan Origins. And we've already had a conversation on this about whether it should be Denisovan or Denisovan. And the answer is Denisovan, because the people that came up with this name who were members of the Max Planck Institute of Physical Anthropology at Leipzig in Germany. This was the name they come up with. This was the pronunciation, Denisovan. And it's after the Denisovan Cave, which is where we learn about the people we're going to be talking about, and that's the Denisovans for the first time. It becomes what's known as their type site, the place where their remains are first found, that, evidence of their culture is first excavated and identified. So, and the reason why it's called Denisovan Cave is because in the 18th century, there was a monk or a hermit who actually lived in the cave, and his name was Denisa. Denisa. And you have to remember we're in Russia here, so everything's pronounced slightly different to how we might do in the West. It's not Dennis, like I might say in England. You know what I mean? It's Denisa. I've also verified that with some of my Eastern European friends. I've said, look, if you see this name, Denisa, how is it pronounced? And they say the same. So it is Denisovans, not Denisovans. I suppose to some people it's going to be tomato and tomato, isn't it? But who cares? I mean, it's definitely pronounced Denisovan. So
now, and you mention that this is Russia, specifically Siberia. Yeah. And as we get into this discussion tonight, there is a lot to talk about here. Obviously, in the title, where we've got hybrid humans and Gobekli Tepe and the genesis of giants of ancient America. There's a lot to go over. But there is, and it's an incredible read, and I've now started my second pass through the book. It's absolutely well written. You do the first half of the book, and Gregory Little does the second half. Great illustrations, and it's laid out well. But there was one... and we got to get into who they are and were. That's very, very important. But there was one fact that is pointed out in this book, and I had to go back and do some research. I didn't realize this, that there is some mitochondria DNA evidence of the Denisovan interaction all the way up to 15,000 BC. And
that's right. Yeah.
That's pretty incredible when we think about, Neanderthal or other, where we're reaching back to, 35, 40, 50,000 years ago and Cro-Magnon. But were they around to 15,000 BC? Am I understanding this correctly?
I mean, obviously we haven't got a window into 15,000 years ago to give us the exact answer, but the evidence of this comes from genetics. You see, let's go into the story now. Before 2010, we didn't even know anything about the Denisovans. But in that year, a piece of finger bone that had been found 2 years early inside that cave, inside an occupational level that was full of cultural artifacts going back to about 40 to 50,000 years ago. When they sequenced the genome of this little finger bone, they found that it belonged to a type of human that was not Neanderthal and was not anatomical modern humans. In other words, Homo sapiens. It was brand new. This stunned them because, obviously we knew about the Neanderthals back in the 19th century. And, we've got, at least a dozen to 20 full skeletons plus hundreds of other bones and skulls and whatever of them. And obviously we've got the anatomical remains of ourselves going back, 200,000 years ago. But we certainly have not seen these people before. So they gained the name Denisovan from the people that did the sequencing, which was the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And we started to look at who they were, their culture, their achievements based on all of the artifacts that were found, and we'll talk about those. But what also became very apparent very quickly was that there was a number of modern human populations that had a percentage of Denisovan DNA, and this DNA was both mitochondrial, and mitochondrial DNA is the DNA of the bacteria in our bodies. It's essential, and it's like the workers on behalf of the cells, but it is bacteria. It was introduced at some point, the so-called mitochondrial Eve, who's supposedly the first person that had all of this. And it was then passed on through the female line down to the modern day. But because mitochondrial DNA mutates at a fairly regular rate, each different mutation has its own designation, whether it be haplogroup A, B, C, D, or whatever. We can somehow recognize this and start piecing the jigsaw together and create like a family tree based on it. That's what mitochondrial DNA is about. But there's also obviously nuclear DNA, and the nuclear DNA relates specifically to what builds us, what creates our fingers, creates our eyes, creates our toes, creates our brains, makes us think, makes us work, and makes us who we are. And of course, obviously, that also mutates, but in a slightly different manner. But what we can say is that the genes that make up the genome, are found again and again within humans, obviously, because, the same ones make fingers in everybody. But when you start finding genes that are not part of our own genome, you've got to say, well, where do they come from? Well, in a lot of cases, we don't know. But what we do know now is that some of them came from the Denisovans, just in the same way that some of them came from the Neanderthals. A lot of people in the Western world, in fact, also the Eastern world as well, certainly in Eurasia, have Neanderthal DNA, anything up to 2 to 3%. But a lot of people in Eastern Asia, Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, places like Papua New Guinea and Australia have Denisovan DNA in anything up to a percentage of around 5 to 6%.
Some as high as 17%.
No, not as far as I'm aware. I mean, these are averages, obviously.
Right.
So, in other words, say, for instance, it said that, 3% has been found in a particular population. What that means is that some people could have none, but some people could have 6. That's the way it works. So that's the average of what you can find, and that's averaged over an entire population. That's the way it works. But having said that, it generally does keep around a certain percentage, with sometimes it going up, sometimes it going down slightly. I mean, this is the case, for instance, with various Native American tribes. They have a potential of anything up to 3% Denisovan DNA. For instance, the Ojibwa, particularly the Ojibwa in the Great Lakes region, they've got quite a percentage. But that doesn't mean if you pin down an Ojibwa today and extract his DNA that he's going to have 3%. He has the potential of anything up to that. That's what's been found. But generally, it's actually a lot lower than that. But going back to the 15,000 years ago, what they found is that there are certain populations, particularly in Papua New Guinea and the Philippines, and with some also in Java in Indonesia, that have a type of Denisovan DNA that looks new. Now, I have no idea how that works. I mean, I'm not a geneticist. I can only report, because my background is journalism. But, that when they look at it, they say the type of DNA here looks younger than what we expected for the Denisovans in other areas. And we suspect, therefore, that it must have been part of what they call an introgression. That means, interbreeding at a much later date, as late as 15,000 years ago. So what they're saying is that it is possible that there were Denisovans hanging around through until 15,000 years ago. But on the other hand, they could have been Denisovan hybrids. In other words, human/Denisovan hybrids, which were very strongly Denisovan. In other words, so strong that they passed on strong genes at that time. So we don't know, but it is possible, yes, that some Denisovans hung around until 15,000 years ago. And as you say, it's fairly modern. I mean, it's the end of the last ice age, which technically was about 13,000 BC, 15,000 years ago. Just before the big cataclysm, which we now know took place, the so-called Younger Dryas impact event, which occurred in 11,600 years ago. So, just shortly after that time, really.
Well, let me jump in. Let me jump in right there. We need to take our break, and we're just going to pick up where we're leaving off right here. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. It's an incredible part of our history, and it's so well done in Andrew's new book. We're going to discuss all of it tonight. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church, on the Game Changer Network and KGRA, The Planet. Stay with us. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tonight, our guest, Andrew Collins. We're talking about his new book, Denisovan Origins. It's incredible. Hybrid humans, Göbekli Tepe, and the genesis of giants of ancient America. There is a lot in this book. It is illustrated. Great color section in the middle, by the way. Really well done, and it's very comprehensive, Andrew. And for me, this is the kind of stuff that I enjoy, and it's a tremendous read. We left off right before the break talking about the Younger Dryas, and the one thing that this book, I get the feeling of, and this is because we're going to get into the Younger Dryas now, where we left off, is that I've always felt that looking at Göbekli Tepe, and I know I'm saying it wrong. I don't say it as well as you. Looking at Göbekli Tepe, and you know that we have discussed it so much on this show. It's such a big push of what we do. I had always felt that the construction of Göbekli Tepe came from the north. The possibility of everything coming from the south and out of Africa and going north, that's nice. But I felt like it came from the north and possibly out of Siberia. Is this where the book, is this the foundation of what you're trying to present?
Yeah, I mean, your intuition is 100% accurate. And it's interesting that you should feel that way. It's almost like, when people look at it, they get a sense of origins and, exactly what is going on there. There's something deep inside, something ancestral that tells us where this came from. So let's talk about Göbekli Tepe. By the way, I think you were saying it pretty accurately, actually. Now, this is a place which, obviously, I first went to in 2004. And at that time, there was nobody there. In fact, there wasn't even a road. A proper road to it, and I was there for this big cultural festival at a place called Diyarbakir, which is the administrative centre of southeast Turkey. And I said as part of the deal, could I see some of these sites I've written about? These other sort of Neolithic places that I've been talking about in books like From the Ashes of Angels, Gods of Eden, and others. And they said, yeah, sure, just get, we'll give you a car, we'll give you a driver, we'll give you an interpreter. I said, brilliant. So we went to see all these great sites, including, of course, Göbekli Tepe. And I mean, we could see where it was. I knew it was marked by this lone tree on the top of a hill, but we just couldn't get to it. So we drove through fields to get there, and eventually the car just couldn't go any further. And I just walked down valleys and up hills to get there. And there was no one there. I was with my ex-wife, obviously our driver and interpreter came with us. And the only people that came across was the local farmer and his son, who came across to shake our hands and say hi. That was it. And also most of the important stones that we now know about, like the vulture stone, hadn't even been uncovered at this time. I mean, you could see the heads of them, but they didn't know what was actually on their stems, all the beautiful carvings. So I wrote about that in a book called The Cygnus Mystery, which came out in 2006. And I did a lot of work on Göbekli Tepe, suggested that the different stone enclosures, their axis was orientated towards the north, towards the stars of the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird, this being a soul bird in many different cultures of the northern hemisphere. And I felt that, there was some kind of soul journey involved, using the symbol of the vulture, which was the ultimate symbol of death and rebirth in the Neolithic period. And that, they believed in some kind of sky world entered through the constellation of Cygnus. And that's what I wrote in the Cygnus Mystery. And then years later, they find this beautiful stone 43, which we now know as a vulture stone, which is almost like this sky map of different creatures that are quite clearly representing the night sky. And I think that virtually every researcher who looks at that stone has come to that conclusion. They haven't necessarily always come to the conclusion about what stars or constellations are being represented. But I mean, for instance, one of the animals on there, or creatures, is a scorpion, which as early as I think 2008, a astronomer by the name of Juan Belmonte suggested was the earliest representation of the constellation of Scorpius, which we know was later identified by Mesopotamian cultures like the Sumerians and the Akkadians and the Babylonians as a scorpion. So, he proposed that. So that was the beginning, really, to say, right, well, if there's a scorpion on there, what does the vulture represent? Well, it was somebody else, actually, an Armenian academic, who came back and said that vulture is a representation of Cygnus as the main feature on the whole of this stone, because that's the way Cygnus looked back in about 9,500 BC. It had this strange W-shaped wings, this creature, and you could put all the stars within it perfectly. And what's interesting is the reason why these Armenians were interested in this is because in Armenia, the constellation of Cygnus is not a swan, it's a vulture. And it's also a vulture in the Near East. It's also a vulture in Greece, as well as it is as a swan. And so that's how they were able to identify it so easily. And of course, this came together perfectly with what I'd already suggested to do with the astronomy of Göbekli Tepe, that the stone enclosures were orientated towards the north, towards this point on the horizon where the brightest star of Cygnus would set each night. But anyway, coming back to the origins of these ideas, well, in the book Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, which came out in 2014, I obviously furthered these ideas. And what I tried to show was that there was considerable evidence to demonstrate that the people that had constructed Göbekli Tepe must have come from the north, probably via the Caucasus region, which is the mountain range between the Black Sea towards the west and the Caspian Sea towards the east, and that they'd come from probably beyond that on the Russian steppe somewhere. Now, that's what I said. Now, I pinpointed a particular culture known as the Swiderians, and they ranged in their territories from the Ural Mountains in the east to the Carpathian Mountains of the west. Now, the Carpathians obviously is in the region of places like Romania, Hungary, Poland, etc., etc. That's as far as they went. And what I showed is that the stone tools that were being discovered at Göbekli Tepe matched almost exactly those of the Swiderian peoples. But at that time, this was like a great discovery for me, and I put this in the book. But now I know a hell of a lot more about it. And what we can say is that the style of stone tools, particularly what they call microblades, blade technology, and the way that certain types of these blades are manufactured using a process known as pressure flaking, is something that is very easily traced. It's like a paper trail, if you like, that begins in the area of Siberia, passes through the area of the Urals, and then very gradually pushes its way westwards and then eventually southwestwards down through the Caucasus into the area of Göbekli Tepe, about 9,600 BC. So we can safely say that there is a very good chance that the people that constructed Göbekli Tepe, certainly their ancestors at least, came from as far east as the Ural Mountains or even beyond it in Siberia. And this is very important. And this is, again, although it's something that I've written about now in my books, others are also beginning to talk about it. For instance,
well,
in the Urals,
let me jump in really quick. Because you mentioned something, I don't want this to get away from us. Okay. You brought up Armenia. Yeah. And there is, just because Göbekli Tepe is in modern day Turkey, these are boundaries that are modern.
That's correct.
Turkey is 600 years old. Before Turkey, all of this area from the Mediterranean all the way east was the Armenian highlands, going back through millennia. This is a very, very ancient culture.
That's correct, yeah.
And I think that influence there from Armenia, going from Armenia west into modern-day Turkey, where Göbekli Tepe is, there is a connection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is really important to point out. So in other words, the fact that the Armenians are identifying a vulture, a Cygnus on that stone, has a relevance here because this used to be Armenia, where, Cygnus is still a vulture to this day. So that's a very, very important point there. And there are Armenians in the area of Göbekli Tepe and its nearby city of Şanlıurfa, right the way through until the First World War, when, of course, obviously there was the terrible
genocide,
Armenian genocide, which is still not recognized by certain countries to this day, which is a terrible travesty of justice. They were either wiped out completely by the Turks, or those that were fortunate enough to flee made it back into Armenia, or what is today Armenia. And that's it. Obviously, thereafter, that territories, which were already obviously Anatolia, but still had, a lot of Armenians living there. But at the time of the First World War, now there was this literal ethnic cleansing, meant that the only people that were left there were the Kurds. And of course, they're getting a massive hard time today, but that's a different story. But so coming back to what I was saying about the origins of Göbekli Tepe, I think we can safely say today that whoever it was that constructed it did come from the north. They probably were linked with the Swiderians, who I call a carrier culture. They were carrying these traditions, from the east through to the west. But even then, what we're looking at is a wave of activity to do with stone tool technology and other types of technology and culture and cosmology that had been pulsing out of Siberia since at least 45,000 years ago, and that had inspired various other earlier cultures in Europe, most obviously the Solutreans. The Solutreans are a people that we associate with Southwest Europe, created the most beautiful stone tools and stone points anywhere in the world, basically, between about 20 and 15,000 BC, and created so many technical innovations, which they've been deprived of for reasons we may or may not get into, including the fact that they created the earliest standing stones anywhere in the world. And they did beautiful carved stone reliefs in a similar manner to what we find at Göbekli Tepe, even though there's no absolute direct link between the two. What we can say is that all of the ideas that end up going to Göbekli Tepe and inspiring the Solutreans of Western Europe come from a common source. And that common source is going to be found somewhere in the area of the Ural Mountains and beyond into Siberia, and even beyond that into Mongolia, which is immediately to the south of Siberia, which is somewhere that's on the radar of archaeologists today as being one of the main areas where our own ancestors first came in contact with the Denisovans. And what I am saying in this book, what Greg and I are obviously saying, is that the Denisovans handed our ancestors on a plate the rudiments of civilization, technologies, advancements in different areas. And I think that maybe we should start looking at what's actually been found in this cave in Siberia as an example of how advanced the Denisovans were. For instance, if you haven't already looked it up, have a look at the Denisovan bracelet. Just put it into the Google search, have a look at it now. It's this fragments of a beautiful, what we probably call today bangle, but they call it a bracelet, which is made of a green stone called chloritolite, which is green through a particular mineral called chlorite, and it's a beautiful thing. I mean, it's beautifully polished, beautifully finished, and it has a hole penetrated through it, which when it was examined under the microscope showed a feed rate of the drill so fast that it was comparable to a modern day drill. Now, this doesn't mean that these guys had electric drills or anything like that, but what it does tell us is that they were innovative enough to create high-speed drills, that they were spinning very fast and create holes incredibly fast. But in addition to this, we know that they created the earliest musical instruments in the form of the discovery of fragments of either a bone or a flute in the Denisova layer at the Denisova cave. They also created the earliest bone needles, which almost certainly were used to create tailored clothing. The DNA and bones of a particular type of horse that roamed Siberia and Mongolia at the time have been found in the cave, suggesting to some that the Denisovans may have even ridden horses. And beyond that, they were using ochre as pencils. So what were they doing? Was this body paint? Was it cave art? Or could they have been creating glyphs, and possibly even, the sort of symbols that we eventually end up seeing at places like Göbekli Tepe? And beyond that is this stone tool technology. They originally had a stone technology which was similar to the Neanderthals, which is known as Mousterian, as a particular style, but they swapped over to create a new type of blade technology about 50,000 years ago, which then is inherited by our own ancestors. And what the archaeologists are saying is that particular type of stone technology probably was gifted to us in Mongolia, northern Mongolia, south of the huge inland sea known as Lake Baikal, around 45,000 years ago. This is new. This is something that's only come out in the last few months. But I put it in my last book the Cygnus key, which came out in 2018, I'd worked this out, that very clearly Mongolia was the place of contact for all of this. And that's so important because books that talk about this stone tool technology state very specifically that its point of origin is Mongolia, northern Mongolia, around this time. So if all of this is correct and we can put all the pieces together, here we can show for certain that the Denisovans gave us this particular type of stone tool technology, which, by the way, can't be just done by anybody. It has to be taught from teacher to pupil, because it's so complex in style. And that's how we can, we can work out where it comes from, because we can see where it was and where it reached, and we can see the paper trail all the way through to where it ends up, which is Göbekli Tepe. So the style of influence, what's going on there, the cosmology, all of it almost certainly comes from the north and comes from as far east as Siberia, which is exactly what your intuition suggested.
The dating, and if anybody is wondering about the significance of what Andrew is suggesting here, the dating on this bracelet right now is about 40,000 years old. Yeah,
well, it's actually it's probably more likely 45 to 50. I mean, and that's conservative estimates at this time. But there were early reports about 2 or 3 years ago that it could be as much as 60 to 70,000 years old. I mean, that's just extraordinary. But I think that, they were sort of pulled in and said, look, you can't say that, just say 45 to 50 for the time being, and we'll worry about any earlier dates a later time. But I think we can definitely say it's 45 to 50. Now, here's the thing. There are some Western anthropologists and archaeologists that are still saying, oh, well, it must, this is so sophisticated that it must have been done by our own ancestors, our own anatomical modern human ancestors. They're the only ones that could do stuff like this. But the Russian archaeologists that are working out there now are saying, why are you saying this? Because we haven't got any evidence that modern humans were in Siberia at this time. Yes, they were in, this area of which is in southern Siberia. I mean, we have one body or one remains that were found in western Siberia that do date to about 45,000 years ago. But all of these artifacts almost certainly had already been created by that time. So the Russian archaeologists are saying, no, they're Denisovan. Some Western archaeologists say, no, they're still done by us. And this actually follows a trend which goes back probably to Victorian times, where there's this attitude that, the people living in Europe, were the first to do everything, and that, it was our ancestors, and that people like the Neanderthals and now the Denisovans, they couldn't be doing this sort of stuff. But this is just rubbish, and we need to start thinking outside the box here and to credit these distant cousins of ours of having given us the rudiments of civilization, because I think this is the key. Because if we think of where civilization comes from, if we accept what archaeologists they say it's just a slow process of what they call independent invention that takes place all over the place. Let's say needles, bone needles. The oldest bone needle that we have now comes from the Denisovan cave, and it was almost certainly created by Denisovans. But what the archaeologists say is that people invent needles all over the place. They suddenly come up with this idea, oh, let's invent the needle today. And that there's no connection between, let's say, the presence of needles in Siberia and the presence in needles in southwest Europe by the Solutreans, for instance, around 20,000 BC, or by the so-called Gravatian peoples of northern Russia about 30,000 BC. There's no link between any of these. They all invented them independently. This is crap. This is just it is just crap. It's because you can follow the course of the bone needle from out of Siberia going westwards into southwest Europe, eastwards into places like China, or northeastwards into the Russian Far East. It's like a pulse of activity, a pulse of cultural activity that that has its point of foundation in the area of Siberia and Mongolia. And this is just one example. And this tells us that you're looking for, it's not necessarily people that are moving, although it could be, but it's certainly somebody seeing a needle and saying, oh, I want some of those. How did you make that? Oh, well, I can teach you. And it being passed on in this manner as a case of everybody suddenly having a eureka moment everywhere and saying, how I know if we need to sew. What can we do to sew?
And let's
invent a needle.
And when we come back after the break, Andrew, it goes so much deeper than that. And I couldn't agree with you more. But when we come back, we're going to talk about wheat. Let's talk about wheat.
Okay.
Yeah. This is Fade to Black. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Andrew Collins. We got to get back to younger Dryas as well. There's a reason for everything. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Fade to Black. Our very special guest tonight, Andrew Collins, talking about his new book. It's just released, Denisovan Origins. It's an incredible read. I highly recommend it, and the links are over at jimmychurchradio.com. You can go and click. And Andrew, the reason why, going back to our discussion, the reason why these discoveries are so important, they keep pointing back to one place. Everything keeps pointing back to these origins. And before, Orthodox academia is always going to say, we're not giving Stone Age man enough credit here, right? and that's the part that just inflames me, that there was some high technology, things that were taught from somebody that was handed down. Things just don't appear out of nowhere. And one of those things that you point out in the book, and I have often said, when we look at humanity and we look at our progression, one of the most important steps was the domestication of wheat. That right there allowed so many things to happen, to change from being hunter-gatherers to farmers, and you could concentrate on other things like math and learning and government and organizations, and you're not worried about hunting and gathering every single day. And that was one of the big changes that happened. And the domestication of wheat can be traced back apparently to like within 100 miles of Gobekli Tepe. Is that right?
Well, it's even closer than that. It's actually about, I think it's, just trying to think, I think it's 55 miles actually. Something like 55 modern strains of wheat can be traced back to a wild variety of wheat that still grows to this day at the base of a extinct volcano within sight of Göbekli Tepe. And what this very clearly tells us is that this is where the beginning of agriculture started, and that it was something that was created to try and feed the communities that had built up as an infrastructure around places like Göbekli Tepe. Because, I mean, Göbekli Tepe, as we know, is somewhere that's, 20, 30 different stone enclosures. We don't know how many of them were in use in any one time because they were being built and closed down, built, closed down. But there's no question that many hundreds, if not thousands of people would have been living in the area just around it to service Göbekli Tepe, either stone carvers, quarrymen, people, priests, shamans, their families, whatever else was going on. Plus, the overseers of what were going on. And this would have taken a lot of people and a lot of time. And there was obviously a very structured society here. And to start off with, everybody was hunter-gatherers, which is a fact. I mean, and people say, they couldn't have been hunter-gatherers. They must have been more sophisticated than this. But they weren't. I mean, they were hunter-gatherers, and they were brought together by somebody or some group to work together in this communal thing to create these stone enclosures, 9,600 BC. And you have to start asking yourself, why would they do that? I mean, remember, a hunter-gatherer, all they've got to do is provide for their family and perhaps, a wider social group, that they were involved with. And that's it. They could do their own thing. I mean, so why would they all suddenly gather together and create the first so-called monumental architecture in human history? And the answer, and we've said this before, and we'll talk about it a little bit again, is the time frame. Is because 9,600 BC corresponds to the end of a 1,200-year mini ice age known as the Younger Dryas, which had been triggered at the beginning of it by a series of comet impacts and cataclysms, which had devastated the world and had continued on and off for hundreds of years afterwards. And it may even be that the end of the Younger Dryas occurred so quickly that it must have involved another cosmic event of some kind. Exactly what, we don't know. And this would have so traumatized the world at this time that people would have gathered together and said, look, how can we stop this sort of stuff happening again?
A phobia, a true phobia.
A true phobia. I mean, it's what, Barbara Hand Clow, a great visionary writer, described as catastrophophobia. In other words, the fear of another catastrophe or cataclysm taking place. And it would have been this psychological problem that everybody had and would have to be dealt with. And if you can then imagine that coming into the midst of these people were, these Swiderians or whoever it was that came to Göbekli in the area of Göbekli Tepe, said, look, we can sort this out, but you've got to work with us on this one. And what we want you to do is to create these stone enclosures. We'll tell you what to do. We'll tell you how to orientate them and what's going to go on there. But what we will do on your behalf is to go into the sky world and deal with the supernatural creatures, which were usually canines or wolves or foxes or coyotes or whatever, that were seen as responsible for all of the mischief that brings about chaos and catastrophe in the world. We will deal with them. We will appease them. We'll make offerings to them. We'll try and stop them from doing what they're doing. And every time a new comet appears in the sky, and this is it. This is what was going on at Göbekli Tepe. I'm certain of it. And that's the reason why you'll find that on certain of the stones is comet imagery. There are reliefs showing comets.
I have studied every column and looked at everything. And when you did this reveal in the book of one of the belts with a comet on the front,
yeah,
I see nothing but a comet now.
Yeah, exactly.
I didn't see that before. I thought it was artistic.
Yeah, no, it's a comet. It's a three-tailed comet. And a lot of comets are three-tailed. Including Halley's Comet, for instance, can be seen with three tails occasionally. But whether it which particular comet it shows, I don't know. I don't think it was the one that actually caused the cataclysm. I think it was probably a short period comet like Halley's Comet that would be seen in the skies on a fairly regular basis. And I suspect that one of the things that these incoming peoples to the area of Göbekli Tepe convinced the locals to get involved in this huge building project was the fact that they showed that they could predict the appearance of comets, short-term ones. So in other words, they could say, look, next year there's going to be a big comet appearing in the sky. The people would have thought that was magic, and then bang, on cue, there's a comet in the sky. And people think, oh my God, these people do have some kind of psychic link with the comet world and can, and can predict when these stuffs are coming. And I think that it's stuff like this that would have convinced the people to come on board on such on such projects. And that the reason why you have this massive 18.5 feet tall monolith, well, in fact, two, but one in particular with this comet design at the center of the oldest and most sophisticated enclosure at Göbekli Tepe, which is enclosure D. The reason why you've got this anthropomorphic character there with this T-shaped head is that what he represents is one of these comet shamans. In other words, or certainly the memory of somebody who was able to hold back the forces that were destroying the world during the Younger Dryas impact event. In other words, it symbolized, those that had saved the world. So he was quite literally a savior of the world, literally. And that's the reason why he's represented there with this belt, and where the belt buckle is, and that's what it is. It's a belt buckle, is this comet design. That's his symbol, because that's what he does. He's a comet shaman. And the shamans that would continue this tradition in the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe would do exactly the same. Every time a comet came into the sky, they would go into an altered state of consciousness. They would project their minds, their astral bodies into the sky world, which they would enter via the constellation of Cygnus, that seems to be like the guardian to the entrance of the sky world. And I show very clearly that this is a map. The Pillar 43, the so-called Vulture Stone, is a map of the sky world, shows that cosmic journey that the shaman and any other soul going into the sky world would take, and they would deal with it on behalf of the communities. They would then come out their altered state of consciousness and say, right, it's all sorted. There's not going to be a catastrophe this week. You can all go back to your homes and everything will be safe. And these type of rituals were going on around the world, certainly through until the last few hundred years. I mean, for instance, I record in this book, as I've recorded in past books, a account of just such a ritual taking place in Mexico at the time of first contact. I think it was a Jesuit priest is going through a Mexican village, and there's a comet in the sky. Everybody's flapping, and the priests come out dressed in animal garments, particularly that of a fox pelt. This is crucial, because beneath that symbol of the comet on Pillar 18, this huge great monolith at Göbekli Tepe, hanging beneath that is a fox pelt relief. And foxes are one of the symbols of comets. Fox tails are the tail of the comets, right the way through to the present day. Even in British heraldry in my own country, the fox tail is a symbol of a comet.
And there's a fox on one of the pillars at Gobekli Tepe.
Well, there's foxes on many of them. In fact, the most common animal remains that are found inside the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are fox bones. And this has prompted the main archaeologists involved, particularly Klaus Schmidt, who's no longer with us, and another guy called Joris Peters, who's an expert on animal bones, that was working at the site, to conclude that some kind of cult associated with the fox was going on at Göbekli Tepe, and I think that's absolutely correct. And that one of the symbols that was connected and associated with comets and their appearance in the skies and cataclysms was the fox. It was a trickster, just in the same way that in the United States, the wolf, or particularly the coyote, is a trickster. And those tricksters could cause mischief, and that mischief could end up with the destruction of the world, if it was not kept in check. And I think that it's a similar thing. And I mean, the most obvious canine or lichen-based trickster that in Europe, for instance, is the wolf Fenris or Fenrir, who is the massive giant wolf that nearly brings about the destruction of the world in Ragnarok. This is a story of the memory of the Younger Dryas event and the fear that this is going to happen again, that Ragnarok is going to happen at some point in the future. This was the belief amongst the peoples of Scandinavia, the so-called Norse myths. But as I show in an earlier book, these traditions to do with a canine or a wolf being connected with cosmic destruction is something that's widespread, not just in Scandinavia, but across Europe, in Russia, and in other parts of the world, going right the way across to China. So, these are all ideas which are associated with the period just before the construction of Göbekli Tepe, and give us a motivation for why it was constructed. And again, these were ideas I originally put in Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods in 2014, and a number of other key researchers, some of them academics, have taken this and run with it now. And you'll find this in other people's books now. And I think that we're on the right track. I think this is exactly what was going on, because 9,600 BC, when the earliest enclosures of Göbekli Tepe were constructed, this is the tail end of that time, the very decade that this Younger Dryas event ends. It's also the date that Plato gives us for the destruction of Atlantis. And I think this is crucial as well, because Plato was very clearly aware that in the past there had been a massive catastrophe. He obviously didn't know it was anything to do with comets. He just says it was earthquakes and floods had brought about the destruction of Atlantis. And I think that, somehow this information had come to him, whether it came from traditions in Egypt or somewhere else, that he was able to put a story together, which we know as the Atlantis story today, about this huge, great cataclysm that destroyed the world in the past. He got it right, and he got the time frame correct. And so many academics have looked at that Plato story, said he couldn't have been talking about 9,600 BC. He must have been talking about something that went on in the Mediterranean, let's say 1600 BC. Let's change everything and suggest that it was perhaps a volcano. Yeah, the Santorini, theory eruption that devastated Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean and Crete and whatever. That's obviously what Plato was talking about. He couldn't possibly have been talking about anything any earlier, but we now know that that is rubbish, that he was onto the Younger Dryas event. And I think this is really important for people to take hold of and keep, that we now know that this incredible catastrophe wiped out all of the progress of humanity that had been going on up to this time. And I think this is one of the reasons why we don't know anything about the Denisovans today and their impact, is because we forgot everything. I mean, as Graham Hancock keeps going on about, we are, a population in amnesia. We've forgotten what went on in the past. And I think this is absolutely correct.
Why is it where we have just about all of the evidence to show those skeptics out there that there was an organization, that this wasn't just Stone Age man pillaging for seeds every single day and trying to feed their families, that there was a general organization here. There was a hierarchy. There was religion presented. There was farming. There was agriculture. There was engineering. To quarry and to move these stones takes a technology that Stone Age man didn't possess. That all of this would represent an organization of a community, maybe even a town, right? Built around Göbekli Tepe, and that this is something that didn't happen at 3000 BC in Mesopotamia.
That's right.
But this happened 7,000 years prior, far to the north.
Yeah, exactly. And this is new. I mean, remember, up until relatively recently, the idea of the so-called Neolithic Revolution was that the agriculture came first, along with animal husbandry, and this brought about a more settled lifestyle where people would sort of like stop, and instead of roaming around all the time, they would start creating these urban centres. And then once this life settled out, they started to think about, life, the universe, and everything, and they start creating the first temples, and these necessitate like an infrastructure, and you have the first towns, the first cities rising up, like Jericho, for instance. But we now know that that's crap. We now know that the cult buildings, the places of ritual and ceremony, like Göbekli Tepe, came first. In other words, the hunter-gatherers were all brought together by, I would say, some kind of ruling elite. And I think it was a ruling elite that was coming in from the north. And it brought everybody together in these projects. Now, as I said, I think that they did this not through any kind of military style control or anything like that. I don't think it was about that. It was a case of necessity to prevent the world from being destroyed ever again.
There were no weapons.
They convinced the people to get involved in this massive building project.
Yeah, there were no weapons or anything like that found around Göbekli Tepe, right?
No, not. I mean, certain arrowheads, but I mean, if you go to Göbekli Tepe, I mean, when I first went there in 2004, as you walk towards the site, you start seeing flint, tools and flint points around. And, to start off with, it's just one or two. The closer you get to Göbekli Tepe, the whole ground is covered with them. I mean, you're talking about tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of flint and some obsidian tools. And, I mean, what were the people? So wasteful that they were just chucking them down all the time? Well, maybe, but I think that there's something more going on here. I think a lot of these are offerings. People were coming to Göbekli Tepe perhaps at certain times of the year and making offerings, and they were leaving their objects. They probably even weren't going up to the actual site, but they were like coming within reach of it. Maybe just doing their rituals or making their offerings or doing their thing and leaving these. And I think that this is exactly what was going on. That's why there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of stone tools in the vicinity. But yeah, I mean, people were being brought together. I mean, and you talk about the towns around Göbekli Tepe. It wasn't a town like we think about it. It was a series of what we know as occupational mounds. These would have circled the whole area around Göbekli Tepe, some of which we know, most of which have not been excavated even to this day. They're still there, still waiting excavation now. And this is where the people lived. And they would have then taken what they needed to do, what they needed to have to survive for a few days. They'd have gone up to Göbekli Tepe, which is quite a climb. This would have probably been a couple of miles, 2 or 3 miles, maybe 5 miles. They would have gone up there and they would have stayed up there, done their thing, and then come back down to their families. and then gone back up there again. That seems to be what was happening, because there's no evidence at Göbekli Tepe of anybody living up there. Only recently did they find any evidence of fire. And you think that they, need to keep warm occasionally, particularly if, as it's just after the end of the last ice age. They were going up to Göbekli Tepe, doing their thing, doing their rituals, ceremonies,
and the ceremonies,
and then leaving it.
Yeah, let me jump in before we hit this break. We've got about 90 seconds. The ceremonies weren't religious as we look at religion today. They were ceremonies that were more astronomical, right? And space and comet related.
Yeah. I mean, they were out of necessity. But I do believe that what this did was to create the earliest priesthoods. They began at Göbekli Tepe.
Comet shamans.
Yeah.
Comet shamans. I think I want to make some comet belt buckles. I think that's next. I want some comet belt buckles.
That would be pretty cool, actually.
That would be pretty cool. I've gone back and looked. I've shown everybody. We have talked about this belt buckle so many times on this show. And now what I just looked at in the past is just a conventional belt buckle, but it is clearly a three-tailed comet. Extraordinary. All right, we've got lots to talk about. Let's take our break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what is going on at Göbekli Tepe right now, and then we're going to talk about some other stuff and head up over to Israel. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Fade to Black. I'm your Jimmy Church. Extraordinary conversation tonight with Andrew Collins. Denisovan Origins, Hybrid Humans, Göbekli Tepe, and the Genesis of Giants of Ancient America is the new book. I'm holding it up for the cameras right here. And Andrew, we're going to be going to Göbekli Tepe in 2020. We're shooting a documentary starting in Armenia, and we're going to head west and end over in Göbekli Tepe. What can I expect? What can we expect?
Well, just go twice. Don't go once. Because, I mean, the first day you'll go there, you'll just be so overwhelmed with what you're seeing that you just won't take it in. You have to go back on a second day, and I would also suggest doing it, towards sunset. Just be the last people there and just sit and look and think. That's all you need to do, because you look at it and it's like something out of this world. It's so out of context with, let's say, the Middle East, the Near East, Egypt, because with that it has a certain symbolism which is recognizable, repeatable, and we all know. And even if you find, let's say, the precursors of it, it still looks sort of similar, like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, the proto-hieroglyphs still look the same. But with Göbekli Tepe, it's like you're looking at something which is from a different continent. And when I first looked at it, the relief art, the carvings looked like they were something from Mesoamerica or South America. That's how different, and it gives you a weird vibe as well, because, that Mesopotamian and South American cultures use sacrifice, and you look at this and you wonder if something heavy was going on here as well. But to date, no evidence of sacrifice has been found at Göbekli Tepe, which I like. I like that. I mean, in certain other areas of the Near East, but not at Göbekli Tepe. Whatever was going on there was something much more important, I think, something that was much more a necessity for them to do. And that's what you see when you get there. You just sense that you're looking at something that is entirely out of context for the Near East.
The knowledge that is acquired there, are they allowing free research, freedom of research, I should say?
No, because I probably am the first person to be banned from Göbekli Tepe now.
What do you mean? What do you mean
from
banned?
Turkey. And yeah, this is true, and this has all come about over the last year. Myself and a tour group went there, I think in the fall last year, and we were just hounded and thrown out the site. I mean, we weren't doing anything other than, being tourists, and I was obviously answering a few questions of people. And the British archaeologist who's in charge there, a guy by the name of Dr. Lee Clare, was basically orchestrating his security men to just hound us and get rid of us. And I went up to talk to him and shake his hand. I mean, I'd actually corresponded with him previously to this, and he just repelled backwards and wouldn't even shake my hand and just says, we don't want your lies and pseudoscience here. And I was told to leave now and not return twice. And also, I learned that my name was on a blacklist for Göbekli Tepe and other sites, that basically if I turned up, I was not to be admitted. And that was it, really. I mean, why? Because that's the question. And the question is because I dared to talk about Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is in a country which is incredibly politically sensitive, because not only obviously have you got the crackdowns on any culture, religion or identity that's not that of Orthodox, Islamic Turk in Turkey, but you have an incredible sensitivity about what's going on at Göbekli Tepe, because the fact that it's being promoted as the first temple in the world, I mean, a term I almost certainly used myself here and there, is a very sensitive issue, because obviously in an Islamic country, the first temple in the world is Mecca and can only be Mecca. It can't be anywhere else. That's what the Quran says. That's what the teachings of Islam say. So it cannot be Göbekli Tepe, which is clearly much older than Mecca. So there has been what's the right word, a push to try and show that Göbekli Tepe is not religious in any way, and is in fact domestic buildings that just happen to have nice relief on them, because that is more suitable. And that and that the only way that any kind of religion that has gone on there has to be interpreted through the Quran, and the only way that you can do that is to suggest that it is the house of Terah. Terah was the father of Abraham. Abraham was born and lived, according to Islamic and Kurdish tradition, in the area of Göbekli Tepe, in the local city of Şanlıurfa, and that Terah, his father, had idols, and that Abraham came along and didn't like this, obviously, as he was, obviously monotheistic. So he decided to smash up all the idols, but leave the biggest of the idols, and then tell people that the big idol had come alive, and smashed all the other ones. This is what your gods do. Therefore, they're obviously bad. This is what we're told in Islamic and in other traditions as well from that region. And there has been an attempt to try and connect the House of Terah with Göbekli Tepe. So it's very political, it's very religious, very sensitive, so that, the likes of myself writing a best-selling book on Göbekli Tepe is not seen very kindly. And that my book has been a bestseller in Turkey. I mean, in Turkish language edition. It's on sale, or certainly was until recently, in virtually every major bookshop, particularly those, obviously, that will have sections on ancient history. But beyond this, I'm now banned from Turkey. And the reason why I'm banned from Turkey, or when I say banned, what I mean by that is if I turned up, I'd be immediately arrested, is that I wrote a book in 1996 called From the Ashes of Angels. Again, it's been a bestseller. It was in Times bestseller list. And back then, obviously, I was a little younger, a little bit more naive, and I included a lot of material in there about Kurdish identity, religion, and culture. And I dedicated the book to Kurdish people. Very bad move. I mean, at the time, you think this is a great thing to do, stick it to the man, all the rest of it. But you don't realize these things are going to come back and bite you many, many years later. In fact, decades later, because what happened was that fairly recently, my book in its in its Turkish language edition was given to a prisoner in a jail, quite clearly a Kurd incarcerated, and the jailer took it away from him and said, "What is this?" And it was presented to the local authorities. It went to court. It was deemed that this book promoted Kurdish, identity, and thus must be banned, and all copies destroyed in the country. And that's what's happened. So that, obviously we've been following this very closely, and it has been advised that if I went to Turkey, there's a good chance I would be arrested. So clearly I will not be going back to Göbekli Tepe anytime soon. So good luck in 2020, but just remember me when you're there.
I'm going to wear a Andrew Collins T-shirt and take some pictures. See, this is the thing. This is the thing, Andrew. I have had this fear, this Pandora's box, that because of these exciting discoveries right now that are going down in modern-day Turkey, that the Turkish universities and the archaeologists there are going to present this as Turkish discoveries from Turkish ancestry, when anybody that understands history knows that Turkey is 600 years old, and prior to that it was the Armenian Highlands. That's the end of the story. It was the Armenian Highlands for 6,000 years, right? This isn't something modern. But as these discoveries, even going, like Urfa Man, right? That suddenly this is a Turkish sculpture. That all of these discoveries in southern Turkey right now are of the Turkish people, and that's probably ultimately, like you were just presenting, is what's going to happen with Göbekli Tepe.
Well, I mean, obviously, what's going on in northern Syria with the Kurds at the moment is just basically ethnic cleansing again. Thousands of people being killed virtually on a daily basis by Turkish armed forces, trying to clear the area completely of any Kurdish ethnicity. That's obviously very sad, and I seriously angers me because, I've had a lot of contact with Kurdish people, and they're brilliant, great people. And, they have their own culture, identity, and religion. I mean, they've got 3 different religions: Yazidism, Yarasan, and Alevis. And these people believe in angels. They believe in all sorts of interesting mysticism. This is what I write about in From the Ashes of Angels. I mean, it so fascinated me that all of these ideas, which almost certainly derived from the Neolithic age, are still around today. And these people are still, connecting with the angels and the watchers and everything that clearly related to the foundations of civilization in that region, and are remembered in things like the Book of Enoch and whatever. And all of this is being wiped out. I mean, literally, because, it's seen as unorthodox to Islamic religion. And this is, a very sad state of affairs. I mean, we probably don't want to go down this road too far because, it's not really the brief of the program, but it pisses me off, to be honest, quite clearly. And I wish I could do something about it. We did a conference recently. We did a whole charity thing, for the women of the Yazidis, for their charity. And that's the best that we can really do at this time, because, you can't stop the might of the Turkish army destroying an entire culture, which is exactly what it's doing at the moment. But, and right in the midst of this is Göbekli Tepe. I mean, that whole area is Kurdish. People still speak Kurdish to this day in the area of Şanlıurfa. And it's so sensitive, the fact that Göbekli Tepe is in this area. Now, the other thing is that the Turkish tourism are promoting Göbekli Tepe. Come to Göbekli Tepe, see the oldest, whatever they're calling it, in the world. And yet, this is an area that if you look on every government advisory website, will still tell you don't go to this area because there's problems. There isn't, by the way. I mean, you go to, they love you. If you go to the area of Şanlıurfa, the people are great. I've never had any problems. But quite clearly, it is somewhere that, like a tinderbox, just waited to go off. And I think there is a lot of people that actually fear that Göbekli Tepe will be destroyed at some point in the future because of what it symbolizes. I
did see last year some photographs that came out of Göbekli Tepe of them pouring concrete and covering some of the areas and destroying some of the archaeological areas there. Why would they pour concrete? Shouldn't every section, every square inch of Göbekli Tepe be undisturbed? There's something under it, right? Going on for acres.
Yeah, I mean, just out of interest, this was a bit of a mountain out of a molehill, to be honest. I mean, it was only on an approach road to it. I mean, it wasn't actually on the main occupational mound. So, that was totally overplayed, that story. But the fact is that they are creating Göbekli Tepe as almost like the Turkish Stonehenge. I mean, if you go to Stonehenge in England, you go to a visitor centre, which is about, a mile and a half away from the site now. You park your cars there, you go through the visitor centres and the shops, and you get on a coach that takes you to the actual site of Stonehenge, which is fine. There's no problem with that. They're doing the same thing at Göbekli Tepe, exactly the same thing. They're modelling it on Stonehenge. And again, nothing wrong with that at all, but they are creating it as this symbol of something which they are trying to advocate and push as the place in Turkey that you should come to. But the fact of the matter is very few Westerners do go to that area because they do still fear that there are problems there and that, bad things can happen. I mean, it's just a simple fact. I mean, I know this because I put on tours to go there. Clearly, I won't be going there on those tours in the future. But, I'm still involved with those today. And, there is no problems, but there is this fear, particularly at the moment with all the problems that's going on in northern Syria and the Kurds, being ethnically cleansed, which is just miles away from Göbekli Tepe. I mean, you could walk to the border of Syria from Göbekli Tepe if you really wanted to. So, you can't get away from the fact that its discovery, the fact that, I mean, there was even a Göbekli Tepe fashion show in Istanbul recently, which I highlighted on my Facebook page, the same week that, that all of the tanks roll over from Turkey into northern Syria and are just wiping out the Kurds, whose ancestors almost certainly were involved with the creation of Göbekli Tepe. Again, this is denied by the Turks, but I mean, as I show in the latest book, the Kurdish language has similarities with certain Uralic languages that very clearly come from as far away as the Ural Mountains and almost certainly beyond into Western Siberia. This has been noted by various scholars, which means that what we say about the builders of Göbekli Tepe coming in from the north and being connected with the Kurds is almost certainly correct. Yes, of course, the Armenians as well. The Armenian culture, identity, religion also has a lot of similarities with what's going on in the area of Göbekli Tepe. So they obviously are another strain of culture that have contributed to what went on there in the past.
How many Göbekli Tepes are there yet to be discovered?
Well, Göbekli Tepe is the biggest. There's no question about that. But you have Karahan Tepe, which I describe as, the sister of Göbekli Tepe. That's about another 25 miles to the east of Şanlıurfa from Göbekli Tepe. That's being excavated now for the first time by a team from Istanbul University. Up to this time, they'd not done much at all there. They'd done a few test pits, but that was all. So that's something that will also open up in the future. I've written about that in various of my books. But they keep finding little mini Göbekli Tepes all over the region. In fact, they're now up to about 15 of them. And all of these are more simple cult structures, like an individual enclosure from Göbekli Tepe, isolated with a few T-shaped pillars, a few similar carvings and statues to what you find at Göbekli Tepe. But most of these date to the tail end of the Göbekli Tepe period. So I'm going to say about 8,000 to 8,500 BC. One recently they reckon goes back to 9,300 BC. But that's, isolated. Most of them go to the end of this period. And that's it. I mean, after that time, they stopped building enclosures with T-shaped stones. After that, they couldn't be bothered to carve any further. So they actually just had what we'd call megaliths, just rough stones that they would build, in enclosures and whatever. And this, of course, is the beginning of the megalithic culture that eventually ends up pulsing as a wave throughout Europe and obviously into other parts of the world, and finally ends up in places like Britain with the creation of structures like, Stonehenge and Avebury.
These other locations that are being looked at right now, is there the same comet symbology, the vulture symbology, scorpions, foxes?
Not really, no, because they're so late on in the day. You see, I think what happened is that there was a lot of motivation for getting it right from about 9,600 through to about, I'm going to say about 8,500. But I think after this time, once there was no more cataclysms taking place, people decided that they would just go through the motions for a while, but they'd build much smaller enclosures. I mean, in fact, some of them are sort of no bigger than the size of a family bathroom or jacuzzi, with little benches with tiny little stones, probably about 4 or 5 feet tall. And it's like they've lost interest in doing it, but they're just doing it because they have to. And then you get to about 8,000 BC, something's gone on, and they've said, "Look, we can't be bothered to do this anymore. Let's just go off and do our own thing now." And that's the beginning of the Neolithic revolution that takes place in other areas of Turkey, in southwest Turkey, for instance, and beyond that into Bulgaria and Eastern Europe, and obviously in other parts of the Eurasian continent as well. And by that time, they had different interests because they've now got agriculture. They're now much more dependent upon the sun and the fact of the sun ripening the crops and returning each year. So what you find is that the enclosures are no longer orientated towards the stars like Cygnus, or some might say, Orion or whatever, but are now being focused purely on the sun. And at the time of the equinoxes, time of the solstices, because that's now their main focus of attention for their religious or ceremonial activity. So they've lost that original impetus of wanting to go to the sky world through certain gateways that would lead them into the sky, Cygnus or Orion or whatever. They've now focused primarily on the sun and orientating their structures towards that, because that's what that was the important thing to them now.
When we come back after the break, we're going to talk about Israel. But before we get there, one last question about Göbekli Tepe is, why bury it?
Well, because they're decommissioning. That's what they're doing. That there have been ideas put out there that Göbekli Tepe was hurriedly buried at the end of its life, possibly because another catastrophe was about to take place. There's no evidence of that whatsoever, absolutely none. Basically, what they were doing is they were creating a layer cake of activity. They would build one enclosure, let's say 100 years later or however long it was. They would take away what stones they needed, smash a few of the ones that remained, and just cover it over. Like they were killing it. They were killing the site, probably to stop spirit influences coming through. Then they'd build another one either on top of it or on the side of it, and they gradually create what we call Göbekli Tepe, which is this artificial mound. And at the end of it, any remaining enclosures were just covered over. The people just walked away. That's what happened.
Well, when I hear this idea, what freaks me out is that there may be something underneath Göbekli Tepe that is much older, thousands of years older. And that's going to be pretty hard to explain away. It's one thing to develop theories on what we know about now. But if this is a layer cake, and I've heard this suggested many times, then we're dealing with something that is quite possibly thousands of years older, and we are getting seriously into the middle of the last ice age. And the other idea is that maybe they were preserving it for us because they certainly left it in the state that it was in at 9600 BC, right?
There's so many, avenues you could take from just what you've just said there. I mean, I've had conversations with people like Graham Hancock on this, and his belief is that it was, covered over and preserved for us to find, quite literally, and that we would interpret the symbolism. We'd realise that the symbolism related to comets and impacts, and this would be like a warning, an early warning for us to look into this and watch out in the skies.
Right.
Now, if that's the case, is this something that was consciously done by the builders, or was it an intuitive thing? I'd say it was more intuitive than consciously done, if that were the case. But as far as whether that was real or not, it brings in the idea of entanglement, the idea of quantum entanglement, the fact that what's going on at Göbekli Tepe is still going on today because of the concept of quantum entanglement, particles interlinked across space and time. Every particle, all particles, those in my brain, those in your brains, those in my future self's brain, those in my me in the past brain, we're all interlinked. We're all a part of one huge network or matrix that's all taking place at the same time. I think that there is something to that. But whether the people at Göbekli Tepe were doing that on purpose or not, I'm not sure. Maybe they did think, we should leave some of these stones for what's coming in the future. I don't know. But certainly that's not a part of archaeology and history. What's more important, obviously, is the legacy that the imagery tells us, and what else is going on there. Now, I don't personally believe that you're going to find stuff going on there that's thousands of years earlier. This was the idea that Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who uncovered the site for the first time, did believe, but there was a reason that he believed that, because what he said was that the people that were here couldn't possibly have just started carving all this incredible stuff without thousands of years of experimentation and development leading up to this. That's the reason why he suggested this. And obviously certain of my colleagues have run with this and said, obviously we will find stuff that's thousands of years earlier. But I think that earlier stuff is in other sites. I can tell you where it was. Almost certainly it was to the northwest of Göbekli Tepe, in the area of the huge mountain called Nimrut Dağ, in the Diamond province, which is just to the north of Sanliurfa province, because stuff goes back there to about 13,000, 15,000 BC, And I think that the people of Göbekli Tepe saw their immediate ancestors as having come from that area. And those people came from the north. In other words, those that built Göbekli Tepe, I don't think were, well, not all of them at least, were directly coming from the Russian steppe. I think that they were doing it in stages. And that the immediate precursors of Göbekli Tepe were coming in from another location. Now, also, we've got to remember that not that far away from Göbekli Tepe are all these underground cities in Cappadocia, which I've investigated, since my book From the Ashes of Angels. I was out there and I found evidence that they go back to Paleolithic times. In other words, at the end of the last ice age. So there's a good chance that some of the people that went on to influence Göbekli Tepe had earlier been involved with the construction of the first phases of those underground cities. I think that that's also quite possible as well. So, it's not as easy just to say that there were people turned up at Göbekli Tepe and said, look, gather around everybody, let's make these stone enclosures. It doesn't happen like that. I mean, this is clearly something that's gone on over a number of generations that's ended up with what we see there. But what I do know and what I do feel is that the technology involved with it did come in from the north, not just Armenia, not just the Caucasus, but beyond it onto the Russian steppe, and then much further eastwards into the Urals, where we're beginning to find evidence of cult structures there with similarities to Göbekli Tepe.
Let's take our last break right here. When we come back, we're gonna head west, southwest down into Israel. This is Fade to Black. Our guest tonight, Andrew Collins. Denisovan Origins is the book. It's an incredible read. And once again, the links are over at jimmychurchradio.com. I'll be right back after this short break. More with Andrew in just a minute. Welcome back, Fade to Black. An amazing conversation tonight. Andrew Collins. Incredible conversation. And now we're going to switch gears a little bit and jump over to the Kesem Cave, which is a lower Paleolithic archaeological site just east of Tel Aviv. And Andrew, what's going on there?
Well, this was something that was on my radar, a few years ago, because I was beginning to realize that something really important was going on there, or had been as early as 400,000 years ago. But it was brought back into my focus of attention just a couple of months ago, when it was revealed that the earliest evidence of shamanism in the world has just been found there in the form of this swan wing bone. Now, swans have been something that have been very close to my heart since writing the book, The Cygnus Mystery, since in 2006, because obviously that's the main symbol of all these stars in the sky that we now see in terms of a cosmic bird, identified as a swan, obviously in other parts of the world as other birds. And here is evidence of swan shamanism going on 400,000 years ago. And you think, what the hell's going on here?
Right.
So I started to look into it further. And at the very end of what's known as the Lower Paleolithic Age, at the beginning of the Middle Paleolithic, when there's a sort of transformation in the style of technology, particularly to do with stone, coming into the Neolithic age, the Neanderthal age, is that there were incredible innovations going on in this cave, including a type of stone tool technology that doesn't reappear until the time of the Denisovans in the Denisovan Cave, this blade tool technology. Plus, they were using, they were recycling stone in a way which had never been done before. They created the first canned food in the form of fallow deer bones with the marrow in, which they would wrap up and keep for periods of time, several weeks, probably a few months, so they could just break it up when they wanted, the first canned food. They also created the first fire hearths, cut into the ground. And they were using what amounts to, polyhedrons and spheroids that look like sort of Stone Age, crystal balls, basically made of flint and also of hard limestone. And the archaeologists that are working on this site believe that these people were into what we'd now see as cosmology and other innovations to do with shamanism and altered states of consciousness. And I'm reading all this thinking, who the hell were these people? And I mean, what's so unique? And then I read that they found human teeth in this cave going back 400,000 years that are very similar to our own. Now, bearing in mind that up until recently, it was believed that the earliest human beings, our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, only go back to 200,000 years ago.
At the farthest.
Yeah. But these guys were doing all this stuff in this cave 400,000 years ago. So who the hell were they? Well, I put my head to this a few weeks ago and just started to draw these sort of like human family trees and try and we know that they're not Homo erectus, who were the people kicking around up to that point, and who created these beautiful stone axes known as the Tulian axes, which were absolutely beautiful, but they produced almost without change for a million years. And suddenly something different was going on in Israel. And then I worked it out, because the Denisovans, who end up in Siberia and Mongolia with these incredible innovations that we've been talking about, start their journey moving through the Levant, or the Levantine corridor that includes what is today Israel, about 400 to 450,000 years ago. And I started to think, oh my God, could these possibly be the foundation point of the Denisovans themselves? So I started to look into this. And what's so interesting is that the Denisovans that move north and end up in the areas of Siberia, Mongolia, Tibet, and China are different, more evolved than the Denisovans that end up going into Southeast Asia and Papua New Guinea and Australia. Their DNA, their genome is slightly different. It's more advanced in the north, not so advanced in the south. Well, if the people from that end up in the southern territories missed out on the Levant completely, maybe they missed out on whatever was going on in the area of Israel, perhaps some kind of interbreeding with some, local people that were there, maybe our own precursors, what they're called non-dispersal modern humans. And this is what created the Denisovans that had all of this innovations. And what's so interesting is that in the area of Siberia and Mongolia, you have what's known as swan ancestry, the belief from so many tribes and clans that they are descended from a woman who was a swan maiden, who came from the sky, from some kind of, birdland or something, that was forced to marry a mortal hunter, and that their offspring was the foundation point of the tribes and clans. So in other words, they saw their descent from this genetrix, who was a woman who was, quite literally a swan. And the earliest evidence of swan shamanism outside of Israel comes from Siberia, from a place called Malta near Lake Baikal, the very areas where we now know that the Denisovans first made contact with our own ancestors and handed on their technologies and culture, traditions and cosmology, almost certainly involving the swan. This is what I said in my book, The Cygnus Key. It's being said again in Denisovan Origins. And I'm now beginning to realize that all of these ideas came from the area of what is today Israel as much as 400,000 years ago. I'm now in touch with the archaeologists working on the site. I hope to visit Israel very soon to go over everything with them. And what we've now got are the genesis points, not only of the Neolithic at Göbekli Tepe around 9,600, but we also have the genesis point of the so-called Upper Paleolithic, 45,000 years ago, which ushers in our own modern human age, places like the Mongolia, the Denisovan Cave, etc. But we now have the genesis point of the Denisovans 400,000 years ago in Israel at places like the Kesem Cave.
That's a ridiculous number. You know that 400,000 years. It's a ridiculous number. What I remember, this is. I'm so glad we're talking about this. When I first read about the Kesem Caves, I remember hearing these crazy statements. Right, that it was 400, possibly even older, occupied. 400,000 years ago. That high technology such as fire. The cooking of
fire and fire pits.
And they found a hearth. The domestication of animals that they were cooking. Cooking animals. And that's just a crazy thought.
I know.
My next question is though, what about DNA?
Well, the problem is that once you get back to that age, it's so difficult to get even mitochondrial DNA out of any human remains. So as far as I'm aware, none has actually been achieved. So we don't know who they were. All we know is that the earliest people that were there looked similar to us. Now,
are you suggesting? Well, wait. Let's not. Are we suggesting Homo sapien sapien?
Yes, but remember that. But that this is before in theory, we could exist.
That's right.
So what I'm proposing, and I've already written 2 articles about this, about the Kesem Cave, one of which goes into all of these possibilities. This is on Ancient Origins website, is that what I think is going on here is the genesis of the Denisovans. And I think that you probably got some kind of admixture between, let's say, proto-Denisovans coming out of Africa at this time and something else that's going on there who are probably our own ancestors. And I think that the two got together, interbred, created this hybrid. And they were the ones that were creating all of this innovation at the very end of the lower Paleolithic period and the very beginning of the so-called middle Paleolithic period. And that somehow there was this spurt of activity very quickly, these advancements, which was enough to virtually create a whole population that then begins to move through Southwest Asia into Central Asia and ends up in Siberia and Mongolia. And I'm going to be writing about this in the next book, which I almost certainly will be working with Greg again on. We're going to, we'll work as a good team. And I think that, we can do something great here. But what I'm going to be writing about is not so much just the history of this and the fact that it occurred, but why. This is not simply a case of genetics or, environment or food. These people could have been in touch with something. And the archaeologists themselves are open to the ideas of altered states of consciousness, primitive cosmologies. And if that's the case, then is it possible that they believed that they were in touch with some kind of individualized or collective intelligence that was providing them with the inspiration to push forward and to create new innovations? And if that's the case, is this something that kickstarts different stages in human evolution, beginning at places like Kesem, but also then continuing on places like the Denisovan Cave in Siberia, continuing through there to places like Gobekli Tepe, and right the way through, obviously, to the foundation of monotheistic religions in Israel, of course, in the same area.
It's right there. It's right next to Tel Aviv.
Well, and right next to the very oldest holy mountains of Israel, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And I find this intriguing. And I mean, I have to be careful to keep it real, though, obviously.
Yeah,
because,
you have to. But there's one other point that really needs to be made. And it is this: archaeologists will get really excited when they find, mammoth bones with flint marks on it, suggesting, some interaction between early humans and animals at 50,000 years ago or 30,000 years ago, right? And they get excited. You rock this back to 400,000 years ago, where in Kesem, where they've got knives and blades and flint and hammer stones and tools and hearths and fire. And
hold on, you're missing the important point here is this is the birth of shamanism.
Right.
This is where it all begins.
Right.
And they were almost certainly using swan bones to connect with that particular bird. They possibly would have been adorning themselves in garments of swan feathers, and they would have been taking the form of a swan to project their mind to wherever they were going. I mean, obviously, it's so difficult to try and get into the minds of these people 400,000 years ago, but that's where I want to go next. That's exactly where I want to go next.
When there's something that I've always found really interesting, and it's this: when we're talking about something like Gobekli Tepe, right, which is so old it's hard to wrap our mind around, but we're still only talking about 9600 BC.
Yeah.
Was there a language? Was there a spoken language at 9600 BC? And as we rock this thing back to not only different cultures, but when we start going back to shamans at 400,000 BC, were these shamans grunting? Or do you think that there was a language? Was there a spoken language at Gobekli Tepe?
Yes, there was, yeah. And the chances are that it was Altaic in origin. What I mean by that it comes from a series of root languages that are all surrounding the area of the Altai Mountains of southern Siberia and Mongolia. And those root languages are Mongolian, Turkic, and what's the third one? Tungusk, Turkic, and Mongolian. Those are the three languages of which there are elements in common with them all, which they refer to as Proto-Altaic or just Altaic. And you have those same elements in the earliest language in that same region as Göbekli Tepe, which is Sumerian. You can find many academic papers that show the similarities between Sumerian and Altaic-based languages. Again, I talk about this in I think, is it the current book? I certainly talk about it in Cygnus Key, yeah. And so there's no doubt that what was being spoken, in my opinion, around Göbekli Tepe was a language that originally came from as far east as Siberia. Clearly, it had gone through many different changes and evolved and whatever, but that was one of the root points of it. But going back even further, did the Denisovans have a language? Yes, I think they did. I think that they probably spoke this Altaic language. And what's so weird is that that in the what was the alien film about the origins of the whole thing, and the engineers,
Prometheus.
Yeah, Prometheus.
Right.
The language. What's so interesting is that the language that they had the engineers speak was Altaic as the proto-language, and they deliberately chose that, which I find very, very interesting. That these huge figures. By the way, what we haven't mentioned is that there is a very good chance that some, or indeed many, of the Denisovans were of incredible size, perhaps even up to 7 to 7.5 feet in height. and that they were probably built like wrestlers of today, like the largest wrestlers today.
Where does that evidence?
Some of them.
Where does that evidence?
Evidence is suggesting.
Where are these bones? Where have they been discovered?
Well, we only have 2 sites where absolutely confirmed Denisovan bones have been found. One is the Denisovan Cave, where you have 3 molars, 2 of which are of enormous size, have been found, plus other, smaller bones, and a jawbone that was actually recovered as early as 1980, but only recently identified in the Tibetan Plateau, a cave there right on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau in what is today northwest China. And that's confirmed now to be Denisovan. It's 160,000 years old. But the fact that that is confirmed means that other jawbones that we found in other areas, like, for instance, one found off the coast of Taiwan, the so-called Penghu jawbone, is so similar to the Tibetan one that it's almost certainly Denisovan. And then you start making links with so many other items that have been found at different sites, particularly in Eastern Asia. So, you can begin to create a jigsaw out of all of these and say that the Denisovans were all over the place. But what we can say is that these items that we found so far, all of them are of exceptional size. And this is not me saying this. This is the paleogeneticists that have been working with these bones and these teeth are coming out and saying this. So the chances are the Denisovans are going to be found to be big guys, no question at all. They are not going to be, tiny hobbits like, the guys that were found at Flores in the island of Indonesia relatively recently. They're going to be big. They're going to be the giants of legend, no question about that.
Yeah, they're not going to be hobbits.
No. But go back to your final question, if I may, about the people of Kesem. Would they have had a language? I don't think so. No, I think that they would have been so much more sensitive to the environment than we would have been. They would have had better sight, better hearing. Their language would have been more intuitive in the sense of, they would have had grunts, they would have made sounds, they would have joined perhaps in some kind of song or something like that. But I think their communication would have been much more intuitive, almost to the point of telepathic. And I don't necessarily mean that, from a psychic point of view. But, in other words, everything they do would have been communal in the sense that they would have all known and understood what was going on, what their role was in their society, and how they came together, and how they would have reacted to certain events and what was going on around them. They wouldn't have needed to talk about it. I think that's what we're saying here. So I don't think that at this point language has developed in the way that it would do with the Denisovans at a much later point. And I think that they are responsible for the creation of the Altaic language, which, by the way, many people see as the root behind what's known as the Indo-European languages, which includes, English, French, German, Sanskrit, Japanese, and various other, Korean, and many, many, many other, maybe as much as 300 to 400 different languages spoken, not just on the Eurasian continent, but of course in the Americas as well.
Andrew, thank you so much. What an absolutely incredible conversation tonight, and I can't say enough. I have learned so much, and the book is incredible. And just thank you. And really quick, I've got about 30 seconds. When do you expect to finish the next book?
Well, I haven't even started it yet, so don't look out for it on the shelves. But anyway, look, if you like what you hear, go to andrewcollins.com. Everything is on there. But if you want to buy Denisovan Origins, just put Denisovan Amazon and it comes up on your search engine, and it will take you straight to the book on Amazon, and just click that. And I'd be very happy. And so would Greg if you bought a copy of it. So Thank you, Jimmy, for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And as I start to roll credits, give me a Göbekli Tepe.
Göbekli Tepe. I'm the first person to be banned from Göbekli Tepe.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Enjoy the rest of your day over there in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much.
Cheers, my pleasure.
Andrew Collins. We went pole to pole tonight, and yes, Denisovan Origins, here is the book. There's the cover. The links are over at jimmychurchradio.com. Highly recommended. Highly, highly recommended. Fade to Black's executive producer is Rita Camarion. Show is produced by Hilton J. Palm, Renee, Dennis, and Bob. Announcers are Steve Harder, Gene Vitola, Mark D. Kovar. Webmaster is Drew the Geek. Music, Doug Aldrich. Intro, Spaceboy. SpaceboyMusic.com. Fade to Black is produced by KJCR for the Game Changer Network, and syndication is KGRA, The Planet. This broadcast is only copyrighted 2019 by Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. It cannot be rebroadcast, downloaded, copied, or used anywhere in the known universe without written permission from Fade to Black and the Game Changer Network. I'm your host, Jimmy Church. Tomorrow night, right here, Jeffrey Mishlov. I want to thank Andrew Collins. Until tomorrow night, I want everybody to be safe. Göbekli Tepe.